Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third of our Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology virtual salons. We're very happy to have you with us for Reclaiming Generalization for Qualitative Research: How, Why, and to What. In just a few moments, I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to today's chair, Dr. Heidi Levitt. But I know we have some newcomers to our salons here today, so just wanted to take a moment to orient you to this crowdcast space a little bit. So as you can see, we've got two chat areas. Some of you have already been introducing yourself in the chat sidebar, which is wonderful. We all get to know each other a little bit. So feel free to continue using that chat space throughout these presentations. Say hello to each other, share your reactions to the talks as they unfold. These salons are really designed for people to have a chance to connect with each other and get to know each other. So feel free to continue to talk amongst yourselves. If you have a question that you would like the presenters to answer during the Q&A, you'll see a little section on the bottom of the screen where it says Ask a Question. And if you click there and put your question in the box, then we'll know to address that during or after the presentations. So I see that somebody has asked whether this presentation is going to be recorded. Yes, it will. It'll be recorded, available here on this Crowdcast site and also on our website, squip.org. So any other questions like that, put them in that little Ask the Question window, and we'll address it either during the presentations or more likely during the Q&A and discussion after the presentation is over. Also wanted to let you guys know, SQIP is a section of APA's Division 5, the American Psychological Association Division 5. So if you like what you hear today, please consider joining us. We rely on a robust membership to advocate within APA for qualitative research, the stuff that Dr. Levitt's been very involved in, among others. So please consider joining the organization. You'll see a little button on the bottom of the screen that says Find Out About Joining SQIP. If you click on that button, it'll take you to a page with information about our membership, and you can find out how to join. Also, please check us out, the future presentations that we have coming up. We've got another one on conducting qualitative research with caregivers in November. And then December, we've got one on current directions in discursive psychology with some folks from the UK. I'm going to be monitoring throughout this presentation, doing a little bit of tech support for questions. So if you've got questions, feel free to put them in the chat window, and I or others will check in. I see some people have had trouble hearing, but refreshing the page can help. So continue to, if you've got questions or problems, put them in the chat window and I will check them out. So without further ado, I am going to hand the virtual podium over to our first presenter, Dr. Heidi Levitt. And we'll just give her a couple of moments to get up to the screen and get us started. Thanks very much, and welcome to the SQIP Virtual Salons. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Heidi Levitt. I'm a faculty at UMass Boston, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction to our series. I'm just so pleased that we've been invited by the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology, SQIP, to present in this salon series. And our presentation addresses a long-standing question that has been put to qualitative researchers, right? This question of how do we justify generalization from our findings to other populations or questions or contexts. And I'm so pleased to be joined by two scholars. Let me see. I'm going to try to share my screen here. There we go. Awesome. So I'm so pleased to be joined by two other scholars who have written insightful papers in this area. Tone Roald and Joe Maxwell. And I've been very excited. I've been looking forward. We had our SQIP conference, which wasn't able to go forward. So I've been really looking forward to this talk and excited to hear what they'll have to say. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tone.
Thank you very much to you, Dr. Levitt, as well as to Elizabeth Fein. I'm going to try to share my screen now. And in this talk, I want to address the issue of generalization in qualitative methods, and I'll talk largely from the point of view of phenomenological psychology. And this talk is based upon an article I wrote together with my colleagues that soon will be published in the journal Qualitative Psychology. And generalization is a really important issue because if we do not generalize and thereby make our findings or research results available beyond the concrete situations or context for our research, then we lack legitimacy for doing this kind of research. So in other words, generalization is an existential condition for qualitative methods, a reason for its being. Research has to be applicable beyond the concrete situation in order to be justified. And this issue of generalization has been a topic for a long time. And for instance, two celebrated researchers in qualitative methods, Lincoln and Guba, they write, the only generalization is that there's no generalization. And instead they talk about transference. And I think Dr. Maxwell will talk about this in his talk today. But at least since Steinar Kvale in 1997 published his famous interview book, it has been well known that we generalize in qualitative research. It's just a different kind of generalization or different kinds of generalizations than what they do in the natural sciences or in the more quantitative research. For Steinar Kvale, in an earlier work, a main issue is how to deal with validity and reliability in a way that is appropriate to qualitative methods. In Kvale, he uses the concept of external validity as a synonym for generalization, arguing that the desire for generalization is actually a remnant of a natural scientific ideal transferred through qualitative methods, and that the change from modernity to postmodernity makes such ideals obsolete in the humanities and social sciences. So although Kvale writes in his interview book on the nature of qualitative generalizations, he also circumvents the problem and sees it as a natural scientific and positivistic fabrication and not as very interesting for the humanities and social sciences. So when I stress generalization as essential to qualitative methods, it's based on more of a modernistic paradigm, based on phenomenological psychology, as all is certainly not fleeting and changeable. And I don't mean to critique these researchers, I don't mean to critique Lincoln and Guba and Kvale, because they have all done really wonderful work. So what I'm trying to do is to give some concrete examples of some common prejudices, at least historically in some qualitative research. What I'll argue in my talk today, however, is that one should hesitate to accept such a view, for in practice it has several problematic aspects. By claiming that we do not generalize, by accepting such claims, the humanities and social sciences will be close to shooting ourselves in the foot, for if we concede that research in the humanities and social sciences is not just something other than the natural sciences, but also something less valuable as a scientific approach, then we have a problem. So instead, I follow Habermas, who argues that there's no reason in principle to distinguish between the degree of science, or for that matter, the degree of generalization in the basic and the human sciences. The humanities and the social sciences are as scientific as the natural sciences, but they differ by virtue of their subject matter. They use different methods to comprehend their topic. So about generalizations, it's not just a question of rejecting generalizations as such, but rather that a different kind of generalization is at stake. So what I'll argue in this talk is that we always generalize in qualitative research. And I'll argue that this holds even there's a large variety of qualitative methods. And when we always generalize, we do that based on history, on language, and the way we are structured as human beings through our social and individual worlds. And Bent Flyvbjerg, he offers several arguments for why we generalize in qualitative research. And one of the things he mentions or points out is that quantitative research, as well as qualitative, abounds with general insights that originated in the case study. And the case study was crucial to revolutionary works within physics, with the central figures of Newton, Einstein, and Bohr, just as it was for Darwin, Marx, and Freud. So fundamental and general insights are achieved through the case study. What I would also like to argue in this talk, however, is the fact that virtually no assumptions can be made without being based on general knowledge, and that holds for all the sciences. Even the most particular and specific analysis of a work of art, like we saw on the first slide, we saw the painting of Francis Bacon, and even such a painting will draw on many general or nomothetic laws regarding materiality, historicity, and cultural development. It is rare that we make our assumptions explicit, and it's impossible to do so completely or exhaustively, but this principle is basically the same for all the sciences. And this is what Husserl implies when he says, everywhere the problems, the clarifying investigations, the insights of principle are historical. And he also argues, the whole of the cultural present, understood as a totality, implies the whole cultural past in an undetermined but structurally determined generality. So to put it more precisely, it implies a continuity of pasts which imply one another, each in itself being a past culturally present. So the past is culturally present, but so are the underlying structures of materiality, society, body, language, as well as other structures of the psyche, like attachments, processes, for instance, and processes of sexuality, that all facilitates for how we experience the world. So, and phenomenological psychology has its root in the philosophical phenomenology founded by Husserl, and his prolific writings inform how phenomenological psychology works, both formally and informally, with generalizations. And Husserl's analysis have shown how generalizations are implicitly embedded in the historical development of scientific theories, as well as in the structures of the life world. And his philosophical method has been transformed by Amadeo Giorgi, who's done a fantastic work transferring Husserl's thoughts into psychology, as well as by Frederick Worth, who also have been working on bringing forth a method for psychology where generalization becomes formalized and a necessary part of the method. So a goal of phenomenological psychology is to examine essential structures of psychological phenomena at the general level, and particular methods or a particular method has been developed in order to do so. And the task of phenomenological psychology is to describe essences of psychological phenomena that are common to many or common to those the experience is applicable to. In order to do so, phenomenological psychology begins with local subjective structures, but it also aims for descriptions of the more general aspects of the phenomena under investigation. Often we do that through making interviews about particular phenomena. So, and this level of generality, it rests on Husserl's description of the life world, which he has argued has both common constitutive structures for all individuals, as well as unique features related to the individual life history. So according to Dr. Wirtz, generalization in phenomenological psychology involves all previous steps in the research process by integrating them into a coherent whole. And generalization happens when we reveal essential features of the phenomenon and involves not only highlighting but also simplifying certain characteristics so that they're also applicable to the phenomenon's appearance in other contexts. So in other words, the phenomenon's complexity is reduced as a whole, but at the same time we gain an understanding of the phenomenon's essence. The procedure involves attempts to understand which aspects of an appearance are examples of its more general form. And lots have been written on this explicit method, but what I'll talk about now is how we implicitly generalize in qualitative methods. And Husserl, he has provided us with an explanation for why we always implicitly or informally generalize when we use qualitative methods. And qualitative methods developed, of course, after Husserl's time. So this is not a question that Husserl explicitly addresses, but we can use his thoughts on the nature of meaning, on history, on knowledge, language, on geometry and their origin in the life world. All these thoughts can be appropriated to our inquiry. And Husserl, he wrote a very famous essay on the origin of geometry. And Husserl, he showed that when geometry arose as a deductive science, it was because it had its basis, its original meaning, in some common structures of the life world, such as depth, shape, and length, and so on. So the implicit generalizations of qualitative methods has to do with these common structures of the life world. Because according to Husserl, applying Husserl rather, qualitative methods as part of the descriptive sciences rely on cultural structures that are unambiguously historical. And in Husserl's view, cultural structures, and I quote him, cultural structures, they appear on the scene in the form of tradition, and they reveal that facticities of every type has its root in essential structures of what is generally human. So from a psychological point of view, of course, what is generally human is the topic of psychology, and that, of course, also includes diversity in variation, which also has something general to it. But qualitative methods are part of what is handed down to us through tradition. Their current premises are the premises and their adjustments made throughout their history. And we're familiar with different variations of qualitative methods, but each of them refer to an earlier form until we reach a first or primary version of qualitative methods. As Husserl wrote, it's a continuous synthesis in which all acquisitions maintain their validity, all make up a totality, such that at every present stage the total acquisition is, so to speak, the total acquisition is, so to speak, the total premise of the acquisition of the new level. So that's a bit complex, but what that actually means is that the explicit and implicit premises of qualitative methods are inherent in their history and present in the language and the V horizons of the joint horizon we have as qualitative researchers. So although new knowledge is possible, the present is also the past made present. So when Husserl emphasizes the historicity of our present, of our past culturally present, then he implies that our language, that is, our entry into methods, is full of assumptions. In other words, our use of methods relies on generalized presuppositions handed down to us explicitly as well as implicitly through tradition. As he says, we stand then within the historical horizon in which everything is historical, even though we may know very little about it in a definitive way. But it has its essential structure that can be revealed through methodological inquiry. So the method of phenomenological psychology is really about trying to get rid of as many assumptions as possible in order to investigate the essential structures. What these are is still, of course, an open question, but it has a beginning in the body and our social relations that is mediated by language, culture, and thereby history. And this does not mean that all the received assumptions and generalizations are true and true for all cases. It doesn't mean that what is general can be applied to all particular cases. The generalization does not pertain to the unique aspects of an individual, but to those that are general or common among humans. So science, as a search for truth, has as one of its tasks to seek to question the generalized assumptions we bring with us so that it is both explicit and implicit truths that are being generalized. And even though we always generalize by virtue of our implicit assumptions, we need to seek to avoid the constant danger that is the generalization of what is false. Now I come to the ending here. So as qualitative researchers, we are part of historical and cultural traditions, and we thereby rely on explicit and implicit assumptions. For instance, assumptions about what is worthy of investigation, the nature of science, the nature of language, as well as what can be revealed through language. Implicit generalizations are part of the entire research process, and we begin the process and end the process with implicit generalizations by virtue of our historical situation with language and our theoretical frameworks. In other words, the beginning and the end of the research process are complexly intertwined in a web of implicit and explicit generalizations. Thank you.
While we are waiting for our next presenter to come to the stage, I just want to encourage everybody to continue putting your questions into the question window. We'll have the opportunity for presenters to answer those questions during our Q&A at the end of the event.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I figured out how to unmute myself. I was just trying to say that something that's really nice about these presentations is that they'll all be pulled together in a special issue of Qualitative Psychology, which is the journal associated with Division 5 and with the Society for
Right, we've got our next presenter coming up to the stage, Joe Maxwell. Very honored to invite him to join us. He's emeritus faculty at George Mason University. And the title of his presentation is going to be Why Qualitative Methods Are Necessary for Generalization. So welcome, Joe. And as soon as you're up and we're able to hear you and see you, I'll start to share slides as well.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, okay. I can hear you. I can see you. So I'm just going to get your slideshow started.
Okay.
And then we should be able to get this show on the road.
Okay, that's my title slide. The next slide and change to is the abstract. Okay, I assume you will have access to these slides after my talk somehow, so I'm not going to go through and read each slide. My argument in this talk briefly is that contrary to widespread views in both quantitative and qualitative research, qualitative methods are important tools for making generalizations in psychological and social research. This talk draws substantially from my longer paper in Press in Qualitative Psychology. For this paper and others that I've cited, see the references at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay, next slide. Generalization has been a problematic issue for qualitative researchers, partly because it's been intrinsically connected to the concept of causation. Logical positivism, the dominant philosophy of science until about 1950, saw causation simply as the observed relationship among variables, with nothing behind this that explained the relationship. Quantitative researchers who largely accepted this view tended to understand generalization simply as the extension of the relationship found among variables in their study to other individual settings or populations. Despite the general collapse of logical positivism after about 1950, this theory of causation and its connection to generalization has remained influential in quantitative research. This led to the dismissal of qualitative methods for addressing causation, or their restriction to, quote, exploratory research. I've got a number of references in the end of the slideshow where I deal with causation in detail. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about it in this talk. I'll focus on generalization. As a result, many qualitative researchers, following the lead of Egon Guba and Ivana Lincoln, rejected both causation and generalization as incompatible with an interpretive concept of research. For generalization, Guba and Lincoln proposed the concept of transferability as the qualitative alternative to generalization, arguing that this places the responsibility for the transfer of the original study's findings to a different setting group or population on the reader or potential user of the results, rather than on the person who conducted the original study. Other qualitative researchers, however, proposed two different strategies for generalization: statistical generalization, closely associated with quantitative research, and analytic or theoretical generalization, associated with qualitative research. Now, in this talk, I want to emphasize a different distinction, one that's been largely unrecognized in the research literature, both quantitative and qualitative. This distinction is between what I've called internal and external generalization. Although this distinction is applicable to both quantitative and qualitative research, I will focus mainly on its implications for qualitative research. Next slide. Internal generalization refers to generalizing within the setting, group, or population studied to persons, events, activities, and times that are not directly represented in the data collected. This is most relevant to what are often termed case studies, studies of a specific group, situation, or institution, a widely used type of qualitative research. Studies of a single individual, a common use of the term case study in psychology, are a separate matter which I will discuss later. External generalization, in contrast, refers to generalization beyond the person, setting, case, or time studied in the original research to other persons, settings, cases, or times. Both of these types of generalization are included in what quantitative researchers call, quote, external validity, but the latter term fails to distinguish between the two, which differ substantially in the methods used to support these and in their implications for theory and practice. Internal generalization is a key issue for both quantitative and qualitative researchers, although it has received much more explicit attention in quantitative research. In survey research, by far the most important strategy for internal generalization is random sampling, which allows quantitative estimation of the likelihood that one sample is representative of the population sampled. However, there are three significant limitations on this implication of random sampling for internal generalization. First, it's difficult to obtain a truly random sample in a mathematical sense of some population. Second, even a randomly selected sample can become effectively non-random through non-response or dropout. Finally, the results of a statistical test, such as a p-value, do not tell you what many researchers believe they do. That is, the probability that the results are due to chance sampling variation rather than to an actual relationship between variables in the sample population, and that a significant p-value shows that your results will generalize. For a more detailed discussion of the problems with internal generalization in quantitative research, see the paper by Ersikhan and my paper on the validity of reliability of research in the references. Internal generalization is even more challenging for qualitative researchers because random sampling is rarely possible, and even if it were possible, sample sizes are usually too small to allow meaningful statistical inferences. Lincoln and Guba explicitly applied transferability only to other contexts, ignoring what I had termed internal generalizability. And they largely dismissed the problem of internal generalization. See my paper on the importance of qualitative research for generalization in psychology for details on that. This issue is not well addressed by transferability, since the researcher conducting the study is clearly better placed to deal with internal generalization than is the typical reader of a report. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, you got it. Okay. Got it. Okay. No, back to the previous one. Thank you. Okay. Thus, the issue of sampling is important. No. One more.
No.
There it is. The issue of sampling is important. No. Back up. Internal generalization. That slide. Okay, thus the issue of sampling is important and unduly neglected in qualitative research. Matt Miles and Michael Huberman, in their influential work on qualitative data analysis, argued that knowing then that one cannot study everyone everywhere doing everything, even within a single case, how does one limit the parameters of a study? And said, you are not only sampling people, but also settings, events, and processes. It is important to line up these parameters with the research questions as well, and considering whether your choices are doing a representative, time-efficient job of answering them. In order to make claims about the internal generalizability of your findings, you need to address these issues. Are the people, settings, activities, and times on which you've actually collected data adequately representative of the population or case that you're studying? If your results are atypical for that case, setting, or population, the results may very well be misleading for those who need to understand or deal with that case, setting, or population, as well as for those who attempt to apply these findings to other settings or populations. In addition, internal generalizability in a full sense needs to address not only whether the results capture the typical views, characteristics, or actions of the person involved, but also whether they capture the diversity of these within the case or population studied, a key issue for postmodernism. Both qualitative and quantitative methods tend to focus on the average or most common characteristic, overlooking or obscuring the prevalence and importance of this diversity. See the references on diversity at the end of the PowerPoint. Interview studies represent a special case for internal generalization, since many such studies make no claim to apply their findings beyond the individuals interviewed. However, there's still the issue of whether the views expressed in an interview or interviews are representative of the totality of a person's actual views. Well, radical constructivists might deny that the concept of, quote, actual views is meaningless. Is meaningful. It is easy to imagine interviews in which a person's stated views do not represent the views that actually inform their behavior. More extensive interviewing or observation may be needed to discover these broader views, a matter of internal generalization to other aspects of the person's views than those covered in the initial interview. Next slide. External generalization is a quite different issue for both qualitative and quantitative research. Robert Donmoyer argued that the qualitative researchers, quote, have redefined the generalizability question in more common sense terms. Why will knowledge of a single or limited number of cases be useful to people who operate in other potentially different situations? This statement implicitly uses the concept of transferability, which implies that the results of a study can be transferred to other contexts and situations beyond those directly studied, but that assessing this is primarily the responsibility of the reader or potential user of the results. Lincoln and Guba stated that transferability inferences cannot be made by an investigator who knows only the sending context. The potential user can better assess the relevance of the study's results to the particular situation with which they are concerned. However, there's been less attention paid to how the potential user can make this decision. In quantitative research, there's an implicit and sometimes explicit belief that the results of a randomized controlled trial are inherently generalizable to similar settings and populations. Lincoln and Guba, in their presentation of transferability, also invoke similarity as their main criterion for transfer. Next slide. Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy, in their recent book on evidence-based policy, replied, for us, the key question is how good a job this advice, similarity, does in getting you from it work there to it will work here. The answer, you're lucky if it gets you anywhere. Similarity is both too vague, what features must be similar, and too demanding. Almost no two contexts are similar in all important respects. And in addition, it provides no guidance in understanding how your specific context will affect the outcome of the policy. Similarity ignores a key issue for external generalizability. How will the processes that created the results in the original context operate in a different context? Cartwright and Hardy's book provides a detailed discussion of how to assess the influence of the new context on the outcomes of an intervention or process. Although they never use the term qualitative, Their argument is largely that transferring the results of a randomized controlled trial to a different setting requires a qualitative understanding of the processes that resulted in the original outcome and of the contextual influences on these processes that will be involved in the new setting. Cartwright and Hardy's focus on understanding processes and on how these are shaped by the context in which they occur is supported by recent developments in the philosophy of causation. These developments recognize two different approaches to causation. The older regularity approach, which I mentioned earlier, characteristic of much quantitative research, which focuses on showing that a particular variable or intervention causes a particular outcome or change in another variable. And the more recent process approach, which focuses on understanding how an event or intervention affects a particular situation or outcome. These two theories are not incompatible. Each addresses a weakness of the other, and each is best suited to a specific methodological approach. Regularity theory to quantitative and experimental research, and process theory to qualitative research. See the book by Ilaria and Russo in the references on causation for a detailed discussion of these two theories. Next slide. Ray Pawson, in his book on evidence-based policy, argued that the nature of causality in social programs is such that any synthesis of evidence on whether they work will need to investigate how they work. This requires unearthing information on mechanisms, context, and outcomes. The central quest is to understand the conditions of program efficacy, and this will involve the synthesis in investigating for whom, in what circumstances, and in what respects a family of programs work. A process approach to causation can easily incorporate seeing mental phenomena, beliefs, values, emotions, and so on as causes, as well as focusing on context as an inherent aspect of the causal processes operating in a particular setting. Causal explanations based on qualitative methods are typically framed in terms of events, meanings, processes, contexts, and how these interact to shape particular outcomes, rather than using the concept of variables. In a qualitative study, in addition, external generalizability may not be a matter of similarity. It may provide an account of an atypical setting or population that is illuminating as an extreme case or ideal type. In addition, similar processes may not result in similar outcomes. Howard Becker, the reference at the end of the slides, showed that in a qualitative study of social organization in men's and women's prisons, a similar process, that prisoners developed a social organization that provided things that they felt deprived of in prison, resulted in very different social structures in the two prisons, both because the administrative policies in the two prisons, the contexts, were different, and because the deprivations the women felt, their meanings were very different from those of the men. So, to summarize, I'm arguing that the distinction between internal and external generalization is an important conceptual tool for qualitative researchers, one that is not replaceable by other prevalent distinctions, qualitative or quantitative. For internal generalization, the concept of sampling in a broad sense that's not limited to statistical methods is important for arguing that your results are representative of the actual setting, group, or population you are studying. For external generalization, the concept of transfer is largely dependent on the author of the original study providing enough information about the meanings, contexts, and processes operating in this setting or population that a reader can confidently judge how likely it is that these would transfer to a different specific setting, group, or population. This is information that can only be provided by qualitative research. Okay, I've provided a bunch of additional references at the end of the PowerPoint. If you want to scroll through those, I'm assuming that people have access to that PowerPoint after the talk is over. Okay, I'm done.
Well, thanks very much. Just to answer your question, yes, we will post the PowerPoint slides on the SQIP.org website where we have the rest of these videos posted. We've also scrolled through them on the video so people will have a chance to take a look at them as well. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm going to hand things over now to Heidi Levitt.
I'm just Excellent. So I'm just loving the presentations and super excited. It's awesome to hear, and you know, I read both these papers. It's so nice to hear them. Okay, so you can see my slide and you can hear me, and you're seeing the slide move. Is that right?
It looks like the slide is still loading up, but I can see it
Okay.
now. And yes, I can see it move also. So go back to the first slide. There it is.
Yay. Okay. So, this is so fun. So the first presentation was like very philosophical, and the second one brought these really interesting distinctions in terms of how we conceptualize what generalization is, and how we make use of those understandings. And my presentation is thinking about the methodological basis of generalization. And also, it's also based upon this paper that will be, that is in press in qualitative psychology with the others. So here, I'll be thinking about this formalization of generalization that I think fits well with the logic and mechanisms used in qualitative psychology. And I'll look forward to hearing folks' thoughts. I'll talk a little bit about cycles of inferences. This is my, overview. Cycles of inferences and how they underlie qualitative analysis. I'll talk about this model that will help us understand how generalization works in qualitative psychology, or qualitative generalization, and then talk about how these processes undergird the process of transferability, which others have already discussed. And then if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about methodological integrity, but we'll see how I do. So, as discussed, the concept of generalization is deeply rooted in historical understandings that have really come forward from quantitative psychological science, and this has led qualitative researchers to question, is this a concept that's relevant for me or not? With different answers being developed. The rationale for statistical generalization has been, as Dr. Maxwell was saying, based upon the use of probability sampling procedures and statistical analyses. And this was a very central and important mechanism in our field historically, because as psychologists, we strove to be recognized as a science. We are still very focused on being recognized as a science, and being seen alongside of natural sciences in terms of the respect that we garner. So this was one way, right, to be able to argue that our results were generalizable. So it had a big force in terms of our consciousness as psychologists as we were developing as a field, very central place. And in this talk, when we think about this idea of variability and variation, right? It's a concept that we talk a lot about in quantitative methods. We think about the variation, the variability that's in our samples, and how that matches the variability in populations. But we don't talk about variability a lot in qualitative research. And I'm suggesting that we, start thinking about that in a more explicit and overt way. Ilari and Russo say, clearly only some variations are of interest to us. These are the variations that are strong enough and stick around when some things change. These are the variations that are likely to be of some use to us. So the other thing is, we're not interested in all kinds of variations in the phenomenon that we study, but we focus in as researchers on the things that we think are useful, that we think, as both in qualitative and quantitative research, the things that we think could be manipulated or could be changed or could provide insight or understanding. A problem with the concept of variability, and I think that this may be why we don't talk about it a lot in qualitative research circles, is that it often is referring to numerical increases or decreases in a phenomenon along one sort of parameter. So this conceptually doesn't seem to apply very well to qualitative research, where we're not interested in numerical changes in our phenomenon in a dominant kind of way. We're often interested in many, many kinds of changes in phenomenon. So because of that, I'll be using the term variation as a broader term to capture sort of the many kinds of changes that could occur. There could be changes where something gets to be more or less, or changes where something transforms what it is entirely, or changes where something becomes more dominant or less dominant. So there could be many different kinds of changes that we're interested in. And one way that variation has been described in qualitative research has been writings that have been done focused on the hermeneutic circle. And there's a number of scholars who have written about this. And the idea here is that, there's an interest in trying to identify what features of the phenomenon we're studying are more stable, which vary, and what sorts of associations are there with the variation, what contexts, what processes are happening. And so as qualitative researchers, good findings, strong findings, aren't just reporting factors typically, but they're reporting factors that are contextualized and positioned within processes that are happening. It could be social processes or systemic processes or intrapsychic processes. And this understanding helps us to be like, okay, I skipped this slide. Okay, so when we think about this hermeneutic process, here are three scholars who write about this that I'll focus in on. One is David Rennie, who talked about the idea of the cyclical sort of hermeneutic process by which researchers may look at a piece of data and have a guess or an interpretation of what that piece of data means, or a description of what that piece of data means, and then an abduction, and then they decide they want to look to see if that fits with other pieces of data. So they begin to collect other pieces of data and inductively begin to look for patterns that they see, right? And after they establish an initial sense of what is that pattern, they go and they collect more data, right? And they see, is this pattern holding, right? And this process is a cyclical process where they're moving between the meaning in the piece of data and the meaning in the larger data set. And they're replicating it. It's an iterative process. And so it's a self-correcting process. If I misunderstand one piece of data, a future piece of data may correct me, right? And so I continue gathering this and building an understanding. Lisa Osbeck, who I think is here, talked about the idea of how we engage with our data by using common processes that also quantitative researchers use, like using our imagination, right? Using perspective taking and identifying similarities and differences, right? And that these are processes that we go back to our data, a piece of data, we look at the whole, we go to the piece of data, we look at the whole, and we continue using these processes and engaging them as we build an understanding. And then the third scholar or sets of scholars, we have Dr. Roald and Fred Wirtz and many hermeneutic researchers who talk about this movement between the focusing on enduring kinds of characteristics of the phenomenon that we study, and then moving to, again, back to the whole and the piece, and moving through this kind of cycle of looking at these different kinds of qualities of our data. And so by engaging in these kinds of processes, right, and this kind of cycling between meaning-making processes, we develop findings that become more robust, right? They become more encompassing of a wide variety of instances that are related to our phenomenon, right? Saturation is one example, but there's many ways but we see this in qualitative research. And so instead of trying to match variability from a sample to a population, we're interested in looking at the variability in the phenomenon, in the practices that we're studying, right? So this is an important shift here. So thinking about variability not so much in our population, but in this phenomenon through this process of iterative hermeneutic kind of process of engaging with different ways of thinking and analyzing our data cyclically. Okay, so the question being then, how do you maximize the chances that you've described enough processes for your model to be useful, right? And so here, this is sort of boiling down this distinction. So in statistical generalization, it's based upon this idea that what we're doing is we're attempting to match the variability in a sample to that in the population under study, right? Whereas in qualitative generalization, what we're doing is matching the variation in our data with the experience and practice of the phenomenon under study, right? We're looking at that phenomenon under study and trying to really capture what that experience or that practice is. And so our focus is not on the people, it's not on the sample or the population, but it's on, and how well we got that, but it's on how well we developed an understanding of this phenomenon. This, for me, this reconceptualization has been really liberating because it frees me from, and I'm hoping frees others from all the concerns about the N of the study being what drives generalization, the number of people in the study. Instead, what we're thinking about is the variation within our understanding of the experience or practice. And this rests upon the idea that our methods are an emerging process and not tautological, like hypothesis testing, and that we're engaging in this self-correcting kind of analysis. So the logic that is, I think, in this formulation is already in place. It's already implicit in different quests and different procedures that we employ as qualitative researchers to approximate variation. So when we think about case study approaches, right, we may decide, well, how do I select a participant? I want to select participants who are going to be the most illuminating in comparison to the literature or the assumptions of the literature. When I'm doing grounded theory, I think about theoretical sampling. So I think about what is the variation in my sample, where are gaps in my understanding of that variation? How can I deliberately recruit people to help me better understand what's happening in those gaps, right? So I have a more comprehensive picture. In phenomenology, researchers will use imaginal variation. How do I really push myself to imagine all the different kinds of ways that my phenomenon might vary, right? So I can, again, develop a more comprehensive kinds of picture and there's many purposive sampling strategies that have been put forward that act in this kind of way, right? So we have these procedures that have this implicit valuing and centering of the variation within the phenomenon that we're studying and not focusing on people. And so thinking about how can we root our discussions of generalization in that logic, which is intrinsic to our methods. I like this cartography metaphor. So something that I think about pretty directly as I'm doing qualitative research is I imagine almost like a sphere or a globe as being like the totality of the phenomenon I'm wanting to investigate, and the researcher is the cartographer. And so I'm trying to map out what is happening in this phenomenon. And I think about how do I provide directions that will faithfully describe what I see and will also be useful for the participant. I don't need to map the entire globe. I don't need to have a map of the entire globe for a map to be useful, right? But I do need to be able to say where my map might fit in on the globe, or what are the boundaries of the piece of the map that I'm focused on, right? So people can have a sense of what piece that is. And I do need to think about how do I describe that, right? It may not be in terms of amount more or less of something, but it may be in terms of the situation of my phenomenon systemically, or it may be thinking about the intrapsychic nuances of my phenomenon, depending on my research question, depending on my goals. Okay, so So here are different types of variation that I think about mapping as I'm conducting qualitative research. So one being thinking about the variation, thinking about unvarying experiences, right? What experiences are the same across this phenomenon, right? As people talk about their activity or their experience, or the way systems are structured, what's the same that defines this phenomenon, right? And so I think about, not only getting caught up in variation as meaning difference, but also variation as meaning, could also mean stability, right? Thinking about the conditions for variation. So my phenomenon might change depending on history. It might change depending on interpersonal dynamics. I do a lot of psychotherapy research. What the therapist says changes what the client experiences in the session, and how they respond to the therapist, which then changes what the therapist says. And so there's often processes that are shifting, right? And that are important to capture if you want to understand how a phenomenon actually plays out and is experienced. And then I think about how do we enhance our attunement when we have types of variation that might be more subtle, that might be harder to see. So qualitative researchers who do critical analyses often will use a theory. So they might use a feminist theory or critical queer theory or critical race theory. And those theories help them to be more sensitive to types of variation that they might miss otherwise, because often people's experiences, especially that are more marginalized, are harder to see, are harder to recognize. They can become systematically made invisible. And so using these theories can help you be more sensitive to variation as it's occurring, as it's unfolding. So these are ways that I think about how can I be attuned to variation in my phenomenon. Okay, so with this basis, right, thinking about variation in the phenomenon, I'm in a better position to consider transferability. And because I've thought very deliberately about what are those boundaries around my phenomenon in terms of the variation, what information do I need to provide to the reader to help them be able to make decisions about what fits for them, right? Because they're going to have different contexts that I can't even predict. And they're going to want to be thinking about applying my findings. And so I'll be thinking about how can I really clearly, as Dr. Maxwell again was saying, how can I really clearly articulate what are those contextual features and how do they relate to the findings? Okay, so this qualitative generalization process becomes the foundation really for transferability, because it's that process that alerts the researcher and makes them aware of the things they need to communicate to support that transferability process of transferability. So, okay, let's see. I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about methodological integrity. So this concept of methodological integrity is a framework that's been developed by a task force of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. And its focus was, how do we articulate the methodological foundations of trustworthiness? And this was presented in a SQIP white paper that's also in qualitative psychology. And central to this idea is that qualitative procedures should be tailored, right? It shouldn't be a one 6-step method fits all, but it should be tailored to the very specific goals, approach to inquiry, and study characteristics. So like the participants, the researchers, the questions in use in a particular research project. And there's two main components, fidelity and utility. And in the paper that will be coming forward, I talk a lot about all of these components and how they relate to generalizability, but here I'll just give you a couple of examples. So the idea of fidelity is this idea that as a researcher, you want to really be describing the phenomenon you're studying in a way that really makes clear that experience or those practices, so that the researcher can really comprehend what those are about, how those are experienced or practiced. And there's 3 sets of strategies here that I identify. One being that as a researcher, I may work hard to enhance the quality of my data. If I have if I have higher quality data, I'll have more variation within it, and I'll be better able to identify patterns within it. So I might work to train my interviewers so that they have strong interviewing skills. I might help them to develop observational skills by talking about or developing ideas of how a phenomenon might transpire. I might invite participant researchers into the research group so that we have a broader range of perspectives to draw upon, so we can really have high quality data with a lot of variability, and we'll be in a better position to identify patterns later on. I seek variation in the phenomenon. So I would try to recruit participants who are from different contexts. I would try to think about what are the different experiences of this phenomenon, and within the boundary of my question, try to think of how can I develop or recruit many different types of experiences of this phenomenon, right? So I have more variation. And looking at the literature, how do I pick to really work to develop types of variation that are not as well understood in the literature already, right? So they'll be adding something important to our understanding. And then thinking about adequate diversity within my sample. So I'll be thinking about what types of diversity are most relevant to my phenomenon. There's no way you can possibly, I think it would be really difficult in any quantitative research project to be sure that you have participants who have every kind of diversity and every intersection of every kind of diversity. So really thinking about that you're not trying to comprehensively identify, you're not trying to comprehensively recruit types of people, right? Because again, our shift is away from people as the phenomenon of interest in generalizability, but I'm trying to think about variation in the phenomenon I'm studying. So, so this becomes my interest. And I'm going to wrap up in a second. So I think about what's missing, right? There's certain types of variability that have a lot of weight in many areas of life, like gender and race, ethnicity, social class. Those are things I'll be flagged to looking at more closely, as well as others. But I'll also think about, with my specific phenomenon, what kinds of variability are important. And so in conclusion, the presentation is sort of a response to this question about how do we justify generalization to a population from our participants. And the answer is that this foundation is erroneous, of course, that instead we need to rethink generalization from this position of a distinctive logic, where we're developing this self-correcting model of variation through a hermeneutic process that's focusing on variation within our phenomenon, not within people or samples or populations, and then articulating our boundaries and conditions to facilitate transferability. And so the framework of methodological integrity can help you in that process. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heidi. And I'm just inviting the other 2 presenters up to the screen. Tone and Joseph should be joining us shortly, and then we can have a little bit of time for some Q&A. And we got started a few minutes late, so we'll run probably about 5-10 minutes over, if that's okay with everybody, just to give us some time to take some questions, have some discussion, and please put your questions in the Ask a Question section if you want to make sure that they can be seen by our participants. So I'm going to hand this over to Heidi to lead us in our discussion.
Okay, so I'm looking for questions. So one question will these generalizations also apply in mixed methods? So I guess I'll just, until I have other people join me, I'll just answer questions. So I think that all three presentations, the concepts that we've talked about, can apply within mixed methods. It may be that they are focused within the qualitative portion of the mixed method, but I don't see an issue in terms of applying the idea of generalization. Tone, what do you think?
Well, it depends if it was a question to me, because depends on what you mean. Because if it's implicit generalizations you're talking about, then of course we also generalize in mixed methods. There's no way around it.
Okay. Can I, let's see, can I, I'm gonna, let's see. So here's a question for you. Well, he's not on yet though. Okay, how can a researcher successfully transfer the context of their research? Would this be directly in the paper? Tone, do you want to answer that?
How we transfer? Well, it's a big question, how we transfer. But what we need to do when we do qualitative research is to make both show the subjective structures, but also the general structures for our research results. And that way the reader can then see if it's applicable to the situation they're working with. But when we work in phenomenological psychology, we're really trying to find the essence of the phenomenon, which means that it's about the phenomenon, which means that it should be applicable to other who experiences the same phenomenon. So for instance, I investigate how people experience art or what happens in intense experiences with art. And so I develop a theory about how art works when it works intensely, which means that this should be generalizable to those who have intense experiences with art when they're affected, when there's strong emotions involved. So that's kind of what I have to specify, and I specify that in the paper, and then it's and then that's of course a discussion that can be continued. Did I manage to look for all the variation and the stability within the phenomenon, and how much does it actually vary? So it's not a closed, you don't get once and for all, this is who it's general to, but it's a continuous discussion, and you get closer and closer to an answer on it.
Awesome. I guess I'll add that often where people are doing this in their papers is in multiple places. So this often isn't just happening in like one paragraph, but it's often happening through the paper. So as people are presenting the results, talking about the context of those results, right? Or as you present a quote, what is the context of that quote? Who said that quote, right? Or where did that come from? And then in the discussion section, setting up, right? What are the limitations of the data? What are the boundaries? There may be boundaries that you didn't even know you had at the beginning that then emerge because you realize, oh, people are talking about in this context, conceptualizing this phenomenon in a certain way. And we didn't really touch upon this other context. So there could be many places where that's being talked about through the whole paper from the intro on. Here's a question on, could you comment about the issue of quality of data and what kinds of parameters would contribute to high quality data? Do you want to share?
Yeah, high qualitative data. So often, I mean, there's many ways of obtaining qualitative data. But if it is through interviews, which is what I use the most because of the phenomenon I'm investigating, so you should find the method that finds that you can use best for investigating your phenomenon. Okay, what was the question again?
About what defines high quality data?
So high qualitative data. So when you make interviews, what is high qualitative data? It's not necessarily that you have many interviews, but what you need is to have enough interviews to describe the phenomenon. And these interviews, they need to be rich in information. They have to be able to, these interviews need to have the high degree of detail and nuance. And so not everyone will have the linguistic abilities necessarily to describe something as complex as an aesthetic experience, for instance. So then you use those, you can make many interviews, but you use those interviews that have the most rich and nuanced details of the experience. That's the good data you have then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I would think about it as, in my framework, sort of as having a lot of variation within the data, right? That there's a lot of descriptions of many types, and as you're saying, like rich nuances, a high level of understanding can be then garnered from that. Joe, what do you think?
I think there's two things that are involved in that. One is the quality of the data. Is it valid? Does it really capture what it is that's in the person's experience? And the other is the complexity of depth. Does it capture enough of it to give you a good understanding? I'm deeply skeptical of the whole concept of essences. I don't believe in essences. I think that what may be important for some transfers is one thing, and for other transfers is other things. And there isn't a single ultimate thing that you get at that gives you ultimate generalizability.
I don't agree with you, but but how can you say we don't have an essence? You're given a body. That's an essence. You have a language.
No, I disagree.
No?
We may be using different definitions of essence, but
okay. So yeah, I don't know. We should probably have questions from. Yeah, we can discuss that, or we can answer the questions. But
I think it's okay to discuss that with you, right? It's up to you. There's a question here actually that seems to fit with this idea, though. It's about. It looks like it's directed towards phenomenology. So it says, how do considerations for increasing diversity and variations fit with methods that require homogeneity, like here citing IPA, but I think phenomenology probably broadly.
Okay, I need you to repeat that question.
So the question is, how do considerations for increasing diversity and variation fit with phenomenons that require homogeneity? So you may say, like, I want to study experiences of grief. So there's some homogeneity that you're putting on your...
Yeah.
So how do you balance the diversity and the similarity?
Well, I can explain it by an example. And when I teach personality psychology, the students, they do an exercise in phenomenological psychology, and they have to describe the experience of pleasure. And then we compare the descriptions across the class. And I had one particular time in which everyone, and they have to try to figure out what is the essence of the phenomenon. And in one class, there was almost everyone but one had kind of the same essences in this essence of what is pleasure. But there was one student who described something very different from what the other ones described. So what we agreed on then was that this kind of pleasure that most of them described, it had these kind of essences and or these essential features, these general characteristics. But what the student who described some who didn't have those characteristics, he described a different phenomenon, a different kind of pleasure, perhaps. We had to discuss what is it that he actually described. It was something else than what the other described.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, that's a great answer. I often think about that question in terms of what is the scope of my question. So sometimes if I have a data that seems to fall within a certain scope, and then I have other data, it's like, now what do? Do I broaden the scope of my question? Do I leave the scope more narrowed, and then I have something, within whatever scope of question I have, I want to have a lot of complexity and variation so I can really understand that experience. But it's up to me to decide how I want to set that question and what that scope is. And that might change through a study or be set very deliberately at the beginning. Joe, do you have any thoughts you want to share on that one?
I don't have anything in particular to say on that one, except
Okay,
that
there's a question for you directly. Oh, sorry.
okay.
There's a question for you directly that someone wanted to know. They were interested in your opinion on the relationship between sample size and generalization. Does it matter?
Yes, it matters, but other things matter as well. I mean, a large sample size doesn't necessarily give you any, and also the distinction between internal and external generalization is critical here. A larger sample size gives you a better handle on internal generalization. It doesn't give you any kind of handle on external generalization. You may be studying a phenomenon that simply doesn't generalize to other situations.
Okay. Tone, do you have any thoughts you want to share on that?
No, it's fine.
No? Okay. For me, the sample size really doesn't matter at all. Like, I think that you have an excellent case study that could be really useful because it may take up, it may show variation, a type of variation that isn't explored in the literature and hasn't been studied and hasn't been understood. You may have a case study on a particular type of person who's in a specific situation that has been completely marginalized in the dominant, literature or in what we know, and understanding what their experience is might be incredibly valuable. So I don't really, so I guess this is why for me, I'm much more interested in shifting away from the number of people and focusing more on how are the kinds of, do we have sufficiently rich variation within our phenomenon to develop findings that are have fidelity and are also useful for us given our question.
Sure, and I agree. It's really not about sample size, but about the cases. How good are you? How good does the cases match the phenomenon you want to investigate, and does it have enough density so that you can actually say something about the appearance of the phenomenon? And it's qualitative research, so you have enough participants when you have enough information about the phenomenon. And that's something that you know through intuition. And it can be very few participants. And I think that's important to stress within qualitative research, that it can be, you can make a case study with just one person. In phenomenology, we often use more, like at least 3 or more than that, to get to, so that you know that you get to a certain, that you have enough density of information. But that's what's important, not the number of cases.
Awesome.
But the number of cases is relevant.
Sorry?
But the number of cases is relevant to this. I mean, if you study one schizophrenic patient, you're going to have a lot of difficulty in making generalizations to the entire population of schizophrenics.
Sure. Yeah, you make generalizations to those the phenomenon is generalizable to, so to those schizophrenic who experience the world, those with schizophrenia who experience the world in the same way.
And how do you find out if those are who those are?
Well, then you need to make more, of course.
Exactly.
I think that also do we already understand this kind of variation that this person is putting forward? So if you study one person who has schizophrenia, and there's lots of studies of people who have schizophrenia, there may not be anything useful in that study. But if you studied one person who has schizophrenia and is, a CEO of a big company and is functioning really well and has different, that study may have findings that are really useful.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And you bring a different kind of understanding of the phenomenon, a part of variation in terms of that phenomenon that hasn't been explored adequately.
Yes. Context is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. The context is important and variability is important, but a lot of general structures should also be present in one case.
And I think the other thing is it gets confusing between cases and like people, right?
I meant person.
Yeah. Because within a person, they could describe many cases of experiencing a phenomenon, right? So it gets, I know, talking to Scott Churchill, he'll talk about how, within a set of 5 people, you could have hundreds, you could be analyzing hundreds of experiences of a phenomenon or hundreds of, cases of it. There's a bunch of questions wanting you to talk, Tone, more about what you mean by essence.
Yeah, well, I'm very curious to hear what Dr. Maxwell means an essence is. But essence is basically the nature of a phenomenon. Its essence, its form, it's the way its way of being. Yeah, and as human beings, we have one of our essential structures is, for instance, that we're given a body. We're given the other. We're given our relationship to the world, and that's essential structures of being human.
I'm sorry, I just don't understand how we're given our relationship to the world. We create that.
No, when you're born, if you take it ontogenetically, you're born, you meet the other immediately. Daniel Stern has done some very beautiful work on how we meet the other immediately, and that we become who we are through the affective intonation with the other. So of course we're given the other.
I have to think about that.
All right. So it's interesting, right? Like thinking about these different terms and what they mean. And there's so many layers of this conversation. We could be here for a long, long time. But here's, I think, a last question that I'll put forward to the group. Is it actually useful to use the words generalization and generalizability in qualitative research? And why would it be? Or maybe it's not. What do you think?
Do you want to go first, Joe, or Dr.
Well,
Maxwell?
my paper is essentially an argument for why the concept of generalization is useful. It's useful, but it's very different in thinking about generalizing within a setting or case that you're studying versus generalizing to other settings or cases.
And I would say, yes, that's what my entire paper is about too. Of course, it's very important because we need to, because it's an existential condition of qualitative methods that we generalize, and that's what makes it scientific. And if not, we shoot ourselves in the foot. So it's extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree. I mean, clearly we've all just written papers trying to argue for this, so it's an important thing for all of us. I would add that I think that there's a pragmatic usefulness because it's an understanding it's a word that's already valued and understood to have a certain meaning. Like I think that there's sometimes a tendency in qualitative methods to create a new word. And I know, from my work on APA in terms of, talking about qualitative meta-analysis versus qualitative metasyntheses. And I presented to my quantitative colleagues, what do you think about this, debate? Do you think we should call it something different to distinguish it from meta-analyses? And they were like, we have no idea what qualitative metasynthesis means. We don't know what it means. We're not going to understand it. We're not going to bother learning about it. You have to use the language that we're familiar with. And so that was, from colleagues who are very thoughtful about methods, that made me think, okay, it's probably important for us to try to retain language that has value and meaning in psychology, but to try to make sure that we define it in ways that make sense and works for our logic and our approaches. So I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for arranging this awesome conversation. You're just always amazing. And it's been super fun.
Well, the feeling is so mutual, as you know, and I'm so glad that we were able to bring this group together and share it in this venue. I appreciate all of you for coming and being here and dealing with all the vagaries of technology and the system. So thank you. And I also just want to say to everybody who's here, continue to follow the salons. We've got another one coming up on November 11th at 7, which is on conducting qualitative research with caregivers. Check out the journal, Qualitative Psychology. A lot of these papers are going to appear in a special issue of the journal that's coming up. And a recording of this event is going to be available on the Crowdcast website, but also on our website, squip.org. So you'll be able to go there, see the video. We'll post the PowerPoint slides as well, so you can take a look at those and get any more information that you want to have about SQUIP. You can also follow us on Twitter @QualSci or on Facebook @QualSci. So if you liked what you hear today, tweet at us and get the word out about SQUIP. So thanks so much to everyone. Before I wrap up, does anybody have anything else that they want to say before we wrap up the presentation?
I just wanted to thank all the doing and great question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And both to you, Heidi, and to you, Elizabeth, as well. And to you, Joe. Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Take care.